In the early hours of August 4th, 1991, the Greek cruise ship Oceanis found itself in a desperate struggle for survival amidst a raging storm off the treacherous wild coast of South Africa. As the ship began to take on water and list heavily to starboard, the fate of the 571 souls on board hung in the balance. With the captain and officers seemingly paralyzed by the crisis, an unlikely group of heroes emerged from the ship's entertainment staff, led by the intrepid musician Moss Hills. Moss Hills, a seasoned drummer and entertainer, had been working on cruise ships for years alongside his wife Tracy. The couple, originally hailing from Zimbabwe, had joined the Oceanis for an 8-month contract, performing as part of the ship's entertainment team. Little did they know that their skills and courage would be put to the ultimate test on that fateful voyage. The Oceanis, a 153-meter, 18,000-ton vessel, had set sail from East London, South Africa, on August 3rd, bound for Durban. The ship, owned by the Greek company Epirotic Lines, was under charter to a South African tour operator, Tradewinds Cruise Company. On board were 571 people, including passengers and crew, who had embarked on what they believed would be a routine coastal cruise. As the ship sailed into the night, the weather took a turn for the worse. The Oceanis found itself battling gale-force winds and massive swells, with waves crashing over the decks. At around 8 p.m., the situation deteriorated rapidly when a sea chest valve fractured below the waterline, causing water to flood into the ship's engine room and lower decks. Moss Hills, who had been performing in the ship's Four Seasons lounge, recalled the moment the crisis began. Suddenly, boom, all the lights went out. That's a bit scary. That's not a good sign. The ship's emergency lighting flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the now silent vessel. As the minutes ticked by with no announcements from the bridge, panic began to spread among the passengers. Moss and his fellow entertainers took it upon themselves to maintain calm, with Moss grabbing his acoustic guitar and leading sing-alongs to keep spirits up. "I started singing a few fun sing-along type songs," he recounted, and a couple of the other entertainers were helping out with that, getting a bit of merriment from people. Meanwhile, Tracy Moss had encountered a senior officer running down a corridor, looking wild-eyed and ignoring her questions. Realizing the gravity of the situation, she quickly packed some emergency supplies and joined her husband in the lounge. With still no word from the captain or officers, Moss decided to investigate. He and fellow entertainer Julian descended into the ship's lower decks, making their way through crew-only areas until they reached the engine room. What they found was a shocking sight. The engine room was completely abandoned, with water rushing in through open pipes and valves. Returning to the lounge, Moss and the entertainment team began to organize an orderly evacuation of the passengers to the ship's open decks. They worked tirelessly to keep people calm and focused, even as the ship listed ever more steeply to starboard. As the night wore on, and with no sign of the captain or officers, Moss and his colleagues realized they would have to take charge of the situation. They made their way to the bridge, only to find it empty, with charts and debris scattered across the floor. Undaunted, they began to send out mayday calls, eventually making contact with another ship, the Ned Lloyd Mauritius. Captain Edward Detmer of the Ned Lloyd Mauritius, a large container ship, responded to the distress call. In a crucial exchange, he asked Moss for the Oceanis position and the rank of the person he was speaking to. Moss replied, "I don't know what the coordinates are. I'm not a rank. I'm a guitarist." Despite the unorthodox nature of the communication, Captain Detmer was able to ascertain the Oceanis' approximate location and relay the information to the South African authorities. Two other ships in the area, the Grasmere and the Great Nicholas, were dispatched to assist in the rescue operation. As dawn began to break on August 4th, the true extent of the Oceanis peril became clear. The ship was listing at a steep angle, its starboard rail dipping into the churning seas. Waves crashed over the decks, and debris, including the ship's grand piano, slid across the floor of the Four Seasons lounge. With no time to lose, Moss and the entertainment team began the arduous process of loading passengers into the ship's lifeboats. It was a fraught and dangerous operation, with the boats swinging wildly as they were lowered into the rough seas. Some passengers had to jump into the boats, risking injury or worse. Despite the challenges, Moss and his team managed to evacuate hundreds of passengers into the lifeboats. However, with over 200 people still on board, it became clear that a helicopter rescue would be necessary. At around 4 a.m., with the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, a fleet of helicopters arrived on the scene. Winchmen were lowered onto the stricken ship to begin airlifting passengers to safety. Moss and Tracy worked tirelessly to assist in the operation, helping to strap passengers into harnesses and guide them to the waiting helicopters. One of the winchmen, Gary Skula, took charge of a Zodiac inflatable boat, which he used to pick up passengers who had fallen into the water or jumped from the ship. He was assisted by Julian, the magician from the entertainment team, who had volunteered to help. As the rescue operation progressed, Moss continued to coordinate efforts on the ship's forward deck. He improvised a safety line using ropes and helped passengers navigate the steeply sloping deck to reach the helicopters. At one point, he had to slide down the rope to retrieve two elderly passengers who had fallen, pulling them to safety with the help of Ronan, a crew member from the ship's jewelry shop. After long, grueling hours, Moss and Tracy found themselves among the last to be airlifted from the ship. As they were winched up to the helicopter, Moss looked back at the Oceanis, now almost completely submerged, and reflected on the incredible ordeal they had just survived. In total, all 571 passengers and crew were successfully rescued from the sinking ship, thanks in no small part to the heroic efforts of Moss Hills, Tracy Hills, and their fellow entertainers. The Oceanis itself would sink beneath the waves just 45 minutes after the last person was airlifted to safety. The story of the Oceanis and the role of its entertainment staff in the rescue made headlines around the world. Moss Hills, in particular, was hailed as a hero for his leadership and bravery in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the aftermath of the sinking, an international inquiry was launched to investigate the cause of the disaster and the actions of the ship's captain and officers. Moss Hills was called upon to provide evidence, including the dramatic video footage he had captured during the ordeal. The inquiry found that the captain, Yanis Avranas, and 4 senior officers were guilty of negligence in their handling of the crisis. Shockingly, despite these findings, Captain Avranas would go on to command another ship for Epirodiki lines. For Moss and Tracy Hills, the experience of the Oceanis left an indelible mark, but it did not deter them from their love of the sea. Just a few months after the sinking, they returned to work on cruise ships, this time as part of the safety training videos shown to passengers. The legacy of the Oceanis and the heroism of Moss Hills and his fellow entertainers lives on as a testament to the power of human courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. Their story serves as a reminder that even in our darkest hours, hope and salvation can come from the most unlikely of places. As Moss Hills himself reflected, years after the event, "It's amazing, even having gone through that, just how much I still love cruising. I still think that it's the best way to travel and see the world. You cannot beat cruising, and I still love doing it." The sinking of the Oceanis and the extraordinary bravery of those who saved lives that day will forever be remembered as a shining example of the indomitable human spirit and the unbreakable bonds forged in the face of adversity. If you're interested in hearing authentic stories from cruise ship workers, I highly recommend listening to the captivating podcast called My Ship Story. The stories shared on that podcast served as the inspiration and source material that made this Cruise Ship Confessions video channel possible.